was right.
So I'll call this work session to order. And first up we have Alma.
Yes.
And Matthew, who I don't know.
Yes.
To talk about the rent or relocation concept.
And Alma, before we keep going, just to make sure it's on air, that Councillor Beatty is out today with a personal loss.
Councillor Park.
I'm sorry, Parks. Sorry. Is out today with a personal loss.
Great.
Okay, yep,
Want me to
go
start?
ahead,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thank you. I'm Alma Flores, Community Development Director, and joining me today is a special guest from the City of Portland's Bureau of Housing, Matthew Schabold, who is the Assistant Director of Housing there. He's going to give us the context of the Portland Rental Relocation Ordinance and provide some background in the process, as well as answer any questions that you may have in terms of having it in place and sort of outcomes that they've seen. So he'll walk us through that. And it's also to come before you to discuss this item. It was action item 2.5 in our Milwaukee housing affordability strategy, and to explore relocation assistance as a potential policy. We're not quite there yet in terms of all of the construct of such a program. So the first step is to really engage with Portland and their process in terms of their and the outcomes that they went through. So with that, Matt, if you want to introduce yourself.
As Alma mentioned, I'm Matthew Schabold, the Interim Assistant Director at the Portland Housing Bureau. I apologize, I'm getting over a cold, so I'll do my best to stay focused in the meeting. Thank you for having me here. Alma asked me to come and give a little bit of an overview of process and structure of the city's mandatory relocation assistance requirement. So I'll kind of walk through that. I'm going to try and be probably a little bit more brief so that there can be some dialogue, given this is a work session. So I think the best place to start is the fall of 2016 during the election, where we had two members of City Council, now members of City Council, the mayor and Commissioner Chloe Udaly, who ran on platforms that were, in Commissioner Udaly's instance, almost entirely on tenant protections, and the mayor, who had a significant tenant protections platform, elected to office by the voters in the city of Portland. And one of the first initiatives that they undertook in terms of landlord-tenant was to pursue a mandatory relocation assistance policy. A lot of those discussions, just being really candid, I wasn't a part of at the time. It was conversations amongst the offices at City Hall, and we were in the Bureau, obviously. But what came out of it in February of 2017 was a temporary policy, or a policy that has sunset built in, that required mandatory relocation assistance for landlords in the city of Portland that under four conditions. So the first condition was a rent increase of 10% or higher. The second was not renewing a lease on similar terms. The third was issuing a no-cause eviction. And the fourth was, to some degree, a combination of the two, a substantial change to a lease at the end of a term. So these conditions would compel, so with a no-cause eviction, the landlord would be obligated to pay relocation assistance as originally adopted, and under the other conditions, a renter would have the option to request relocation assistance because the rent increase or the change in terms to the lease agreement were substantial enough to where they were being displaced from their housing and would have to find new housing.
So I want to make sure I'm clear on that. So that on a no cause, the landlord had to automatically pay it.
That's correct.
On the rent increase or the changed contract, the renter would have to request it.
That's correct.
Okay.
The idea being that the rent increase may not be a displacing action, but if it was, the renter could say, this rent increase of 11%, I can't afford this, I'm requesting relocation assistance, and I have to locate new housing. Yes. So, as I said, there was a built-in sunset for the fall of 2017, and in the process, in the hearing, there was quite a bit of testimony from both renters and landlords in the city of Portland, and a number of issues were raised with the proposed legislation. Some amendments were made during the hearing itself, and then Commissioner Nick Fish, also added an amendment that the Housing Bureau put together a technical committee to bring landlords and tenants to through a process to identify technical changes to the code that did not alter the policy intent of City Council. So to come back on a rolling basis over the next 6 months and make alterations. So that group convened. It had representatives from, I would say, most of the major industry and tenant associations in the city, as well as staff from the Housing Bureau. I staffed that committee, as well as staff from some of the offices at City Council. And that group brought back a series of technical changes in the code language to simply make the administration of relocation assistance easier or more clear for a landlord or a renter, regardless of positions on the legislation itself. And in the end, the group also recommended some substantive changes that, because there was consensus between renters and landlords, City Council was willing to accept the non-technical, more policy-oriented substantive changes, such as changes to timelines on relocation payments and other code-based provisions that needed to be clarified. By about the fall of 2017, City Council chose to extend the temporary policy into 2018 and then asked the technical group to start to weigh in on substantive policy questions. If they were to extend beyond the March of 2018, if they were to extend it or to make the policy permanent. So one of the biggest areas of discussion was around the exemption for landlords who owned only one rental unit in the city of Portland. And so while through the process we identified between 30 and 40 issues that were flagged by either landlords or renters that were policy in nature, some of those were eventually incorporated into the final code for the permanent relocation assistance requirement. Some were not. In the end, in March of 2018, City Council made the requirement permanent and replaced the single unit exemption with essentially 12 exemptions that tried to accommodate the exemptions that the council offices were hearing from landlords that members of City Council thought should be included in the final code, but would also not have a broad sweeping exemption for an entire class of renters across the city. And so in March of 2018, Council established it as a permanent requirement in the city of Portland and gave the Housing Bureau an administrative role, which we did not have in the temporary policy. So the Housing Bureau, I guess a little bit of background on the Housing Bureau. We are not the housing authority in the city of Portland, for those who don't know. We fund nonprofit organizations doing home ownership, home repair programs. We co-fund the City-County Joint Office of Homeless Services. We provide gap financing for affordable housing development, and increasingly we are working in the market regulation space, both with inclusionary housing as well as now local landlord-tenant law. So the role that the Housing Bureau was given was to create administrative rules specifically for the 12 exemptions. Council felt they gave clear policy direction for what exemptions they wanted to the requirement to pay relocation assistance, but did not want to continue to modify the code at the margins when issues came up here or there. So they gave the Bureau rulemaking authority, as well as adding requirements that for a landlord to be eligible for an exemption, they had to follow the Housing Bureau's rules and receive an acknowledgement letter or some sort of certification that they qualified for the exemption. In addition, when relocation payments were made, there was a requirement that the landlord notified the city. So both the administrative rulemaking authority as well as the issuance of acknowledgement letters or certifications for exemptions, and then the payment notification were the administrative role that the Bureau took on.
So who did that in the first year before it was assigned?
Nobody did that. There was no administrative rules that needed to be followed, and there was no process for an exemption. It was, if a landlord felt like they qualified for an exemption, they simply told their tenant, and if the tenant felt that that wasn't the case, the option was to pursue action in court. In court.
They didn't have a recourse to the city at all. Okay.
No.
Okay.
And even today, I think if our city attorney was sitting next to me, she would tell me to be very careful with the language. We don't approve exemptions because the conditions to be exempt, we aren't verifying every single condition to be exempt. We clearly lay out the conditions for a landlord. They will fill out a form and they will certify that they meet those conditions. And there's some basic checks we do for some of the exemptions with the information the city already has. And then we require that landlord, we issue the landlord what we call an acknowledgement letter that you have submitted for the exemption. You have certified that you meet the conditions for the exemption, and the Bureau has done whatever internal checking process we have, depending on the exemption, and that you must provide a copy of this letter to your renter. If the renter, once they receive that letter, feels as if the landlord is misrepresenting one of the conditions that makes them eligible for the exemption, the renter can pursue them in court. The city still does not have an adjudication function in this requirement. It's still civil court with landlord-tenant law.
So if the landlord should just choose to ignore this altogether.
Sure.
Don't care. It's up to the tenant, who is presumably low income, to hire a lawyer and take him to court to solve it.
That's correct. As a part of the overall initiative, the mayor has increased the budget for the Rental Services Office. That's the office within the Housing Bureau that's handling this, to increase contracts with the Legal Aid Services of Oregon and the Fair Housing Council, as well as a number of culturally specific organizations to provide education and legal assistance. But yes, the renter would need to pursue something in either some sort of mediated resolution with a legal aid attorney and the landlord's attorney, or go to court. That is correct.
And was your agency also responsible for some kind of notification of the law to all landlords? Did you do some kind of public information or some sort of landlord notification when the law went into effect?
We did not.
You did not.
So this is the second significant change to local landlord-tenant law. Mm-hmm. And in general, the city doesn't notify all Portlanders when all laws change. Mm-hmm. And so in this instance, that precedent has been changed. And I'm not just talking landlord-tenant law, just all law in general. The city doesn't put mailers out when code changes. We tried to widely advertise it with all industry associations and tenant organizing associations. And we... one of the other requirements was that we open up a technical assistance office that can field calls from the public. And so we have staffed a technical assistance office that fields phone calls, emails, and holds office hours. And landlords or renters can come and ask just general questions about local landlord-tenant law. But we did not do a broad publication. In contrast, just as a comparison, over the summer, the City Council also passed a rental unit registration requirement. And it is actualized in the tax filing. So this coming April, owners of rental property will have to identify in a Schedule R. It's called Schedule R. if they own rental property and how many units and what the addresses of those units are. We're preparing a mailer currently to go out to 170,000 addresses in the city of Portland. So in that instance, we were allocated funds by the city council, and we will be mailing every single address in the city and addresses outside the city where people own property, but their permanent address is outside the city. It's about 170,000, so.
Go ahead.
And you can do that because, I'm assuming because in the city of Portland, the business license is really based on your income, and everyone who is a landlord receives income and has to file a business license return. Is that right?
That's correct. So the city does require that if you have residential rental property, that you have to obtain a business license. Even if you are grossing less than $50,000, you don't have to file. You don't owe any business income tax in the city of Portland, but you would still need to register as a business operating in the city of Portland.
And that technical assistance team you mentioned, so they're answering questions, but they're not taking complaints, so it sounds like.
Oh, no, we get complaints on
You
the
get
line
complaints.
as well, yes.
But do you investigate complaints, I guess, is the question.
No, we don't have investigatory functions. We aren't authorized to have investigatory functions or to represent anyone. Both landlords and tenants have to find their own legal representation. We have agreements with Legal Aid Services of Oregon, the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, the Community Alliance of Tenants, and Multifamily Northwest, and the Portland Area Rental Owners Association, and other industry associations for referrals, so that they know that we're referring folks to respective agencies, but we don't guarantee a level of service, no. So the policy became permanent in March of this year, as well as an administrative role for the Bureau. I have a couple of one-pagers here that I thought might be interesting or useful information. I think I'll start with the one that has the green dots in the upper right. So this is a map of the relocation assistance exemptions, and you can see them fairly distributed, throughout the city. Since March, we've received 295 application requests, and we've denied 72 and issued 171 acknowledgement letters. You can see the applications by exemption on the bottom right. It's mainly it is exclusively for exemptions that folks are applying for. I'll say I think this is the area where we've got the best data because to avoid potential litigation, a landlord needs one of these letters according to our administrative rules. In order to be eligible for the exemption, they need one of these letters. And so, absent having an acknowledgement letter that they can provide to their renter, they are potentially liable for damages if the renter takes them to court, which is up to 3 times the relocation assistance. So, this is probably, out of all the data I'm going to share, the data that I'm most confident in. I do want to flag that we don't require letters for all of the exemptions. So when you see 295 here, there are certain exemptions we don't require letters. Week-to-week tenancies, we don't require. That's an exemption. Where the owner occupies the dwelling unit. So I'm a landlord. I rent out a couple of rooms in my home. But I live in the home as well. You're not required to get a letter in that instance. You are not required for regulated affordable housing. So if the regulated affordable housing is regulated for at least 60 years, the landlords are not required to get a letter. The exemption for units subject to the federal relocation assistance requirements are not required to get a letter. A unit that's rendered uninhabitable through no action or inaction of a landlord or tenant. It's an act of God provision. Obviously, you can't have a letter ahead of time. All of those don't require a letter. So there are a handful. But for all others, this data, I think, is fairly good. That's not to say that there aren't landlords who perhaps aren't aware of the city's requirements, or renters who aren't aware, where there are 10%, above 10% rent increases, no cause evictions, substantial changes to lease terms, or refusal to renew a lease on similar terms happening. And both sides of the transaction just don't know about this or don't pursue it. But I think we're fairly confident in this. The second one with the orange dots, I'm much less.
Before you go on to that,
yes.
Just so I make sure I understand. So you mentioned that, so there's 295 applications, but your acknowledgements and applications denied only add up to like 253.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, 243.
Yes.
So those other 50 so in there are people who probably, are those ones that are still in process, or are those people who probably didn't need a letter because they fell into one of those and they didn't know that they didn't have to do this?
So some, correct, some are in process. Some they withdrew their application because perhaps they didn't want to pursue it, or they realized that they were in a category they didn't need a letter. And then in some instances, there were duplicate applications. So we've had landlords apply for 3, and then we notify them that they have to select one before we'll issue an acknowledgement letter. We're not going to issue one for 3. So that kind of a situation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And so then the second one pager is, as I mentioned, data I'm much less confident in. And this is the payment notifications. So under the city code, landlords are required to notify the Housing Bureau. We have an online form that has to be filled out when they make relocation payments. There is currently no penalty for not reporting, and I don't believe, I think there are a number of landlords in the city of Portland that are not aware of this requirement. So that being said, we have had 242 notifications, and you can see the detail for the reasons and then the payment by bedroom size. But I'm much less confident in this data, that it's comprehensive.
You're saying there could be more payments, you just don't know.
Correct.
And you meant, so the notice that you just sent out was to all registered rent providers or addresses of units?
Yes, and so we'll be sending it out actually this Friday, but
Okay.
We're essentially, because we want to make sure that everyone's aware of it, because it is a tax filing requirement, we're sending it to every single residential address in the city. And we also have addresses where residential housing units are, where the owner's address does not match the physical address of the unit, and we're sending the letters to the owner's address. And so we get slightly more than the number of residential units.
Sorry,
That
residential
makes sense.
units that are rental units?
All units.
All units in
Yes.
the city of
We're
Portland?
mailing, so essentially we're mailing every address in the city.
Okay.
And all addresses on file with either the tax assessor or the revenue division, where the owner address is different than the physical property address in the city.
Okay.
Because we're making the assumption then that the owner lives out of state or out of the city.
Okay.
Do you have data on renters that feel like they should have been paid but weren't?
No.
And so the way this system is set up, it seems to me there's probably a lot of negotiation going on between landlords and tenants too, right? If a tenant says, hey, you owe me because this is 12% increase, and the landlord says, oh, okay, there's probably some negotiated settlements that don't go to court, right? There's some.
There are.
Okay.
Both, I would say, formally with folks that end up contacting a legal aid organization, and there's some sort of negotiated settlement, and then just informally between the landlord and the tenant. We've had a few interesting cases where both the landlord and the tenant is calling us, and we piece it together over a couple of days that this is the same rental unit and the same rental agreement. And then the guidance we usually give is you both need to discuss some sort of reconciliation or find legal representation, because at this point you're both asking us the same questions. Yeah.
Interesting.
Do you have more?
No. I mean, that's kind of a general overview. There's a lot we don't know. I mean, it is still similar to state landlord-tenant law. This is local landlord-tenant law, and a lot of terms of the agreements and trying to reconcile potential rent increases or no-cause evictions with relocation payments is happening informally, and the mechanism for dispute resolution is still the court system. So this is what we do know, and this is the kind of the role we've taken.
That's the only part that's in the...
I'm sorry, Mayor?
Say that, the last thing you said?
Oh, the mechanism for some sort of formal dispute resolution or adjudication is still going to civil court. It's similar to state landlord-tenant law. So that the city does not have a mediation or investigatory or adjudication function.
And
so there's a lot we don't know, but this is what we do know. Yeah.
And do you know what the uptick in court cases is? Do you have any info on that?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. We haven't seen a significant, we track it on a quarterly basis. We haven't seen a significant uptick.
Okay.
Or not, at least not something we would consider to be outside of the margin of error at this point.
Okay.
What do you mean by that? What are you tracking?
So we track the number of cases that go to civil court that are landlord-tenant disputes.
But not necessarily based on Portland's.
No, we don't.
Relocation.
We don't, and we don't actually go into the case files themselves and then create a data. There's not a data set that has that,
right.
And so we're just tracking the caseload. That's correct.
Okay.
Council member.
When they were working on this, did they consider having an exemption for luxury level apartments?
There were some discussions about exempting rental units at a certain threshold. Yes.
And they just
But
decided
that didn't happen?
No, I think in the end, the threshold to still have an effective policy that didn't distort the market, there wasn't really any appetite for that, or wasn't really any interest in that.
So how effective would you say it's been?
I can say anecdotally, from both landlords and tenants, and but I couldn't give you a comprehensive assessment of the market. Anecdotally, what we've heard from both sides of the transaction is that yes, it is reducing the number of rent increases above 10%, and where landlords are wanting to increase rents, they're maybe spreading it over multiple years, or they're holding back rent increases, and reducing no-cause evictions. And that has been confirmed by folks that I've talked to on the Landlord Industry Association side as well as the renter side. Now, there are folks also on the development side that say the impact is somewhat de minimis, and I think that'll be debated. I think there are people who say it definitely is affecting my acquisition and rehab of potential rental properties, and other folks that say, when we're looking at acquiring at $350,000 a unit, a $3,300 relocation payment, while it does affect the bottom line across 100 units, it is not as significant as the person owning the fourplex and trying to do a small rehab. So it's really case by case, but I think there is general agreement that the impact of the requirement has reduced rent increases above 10% and reduced no-cause evictions across the city, as well as just other changes in the market landscape.
Well, I was going to ask, do you guys have data on whether it's chilled new development at all?
There's no data that could draw a conclusion either way. think people are claiming on both sides, but there's no
Right.
study that has been done to try and draw that conclusion. No.
And we received correspondence saying that there's absolutely no doubt that's shrinking the rental market. You don't have data one way or the other on that, and specifically that some people are converting to Airbnb, or they're just selling their rental and letting it be owner-occupied.
Well, I can definitely tell you that it's happening transactionally. I don't know if it is happening broadly across the market. I mean, we have landlords who call in and complain to the line about the policy decision, who aren't happy with it, and they have told us they're selling the unit and getting out of the rental business in the city. We don't track who buys it and what is happening to it, if it is a for sale unit or if it becomes another renter unit and it's owned by an institutional investor or somebody who has a larger portfolio. So I couldn't tell you with confidence what the impact on the overall market in the city is.
Okay.
There was-
Well, go ahead. I just have a couple of more factual questions, but how did you determine the values that were going to be for the relocation assistance for each bedroom?
So I did not determine the values.
How did the city determine?
The council office that were working on it, they estimated the values of what it would cost to move and for first and last month's rent in a new apartment based on the city averages at the time.
The city averages of what, moving cost?
Of rent.
First and last.
First and last, and then what
For those size units?
security deposit, yes.
Okay. Okay. And is it indexed to any kind of CPI?
It is not currently indexed. It is dollar amounts in code.
All right.
Now that it was adopted in March, it's not, there's no sunset.
There's no
It's
sunset.
indefinite.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay. That was another question, whether it was tied to vacancy rates of any kind or something. It's not.
No.
There was a line that says, in the event that the tenant has not repaid the relocation assistance to the landlord or provided the landlord with termination notice on or before the expiration of the relocation period, the tenant shall be in violation of this subsection.
Yes.
And then what? I guess, what does that mean to the tenant in reality?
So the whole situation or just the end piece?
Just the part where they're in violation.
Right. So I can speak to the origin of that too, if you'd like.
Well, I can imagine, but this is on page WS 12. It's about a third of the way down the page.
Yeah, so what the mayor is referring to is this was actually a provision that was to some degree negotiated between the landlords and the tenants. While they didn't agree on the policy, they were mediating discussions around changes. And one of the questions that came up was, well, oftentimes it's a difficult decision for renters in the instance of a rent increase above 10% to make a determination about whether, even if they can't afford the rent increase, that they are able to move to a new place in the city, and whether or not they can afford a new rental. And in the original code, the renter had 14 days to notify the landlord that they wanted relocation assistance, and the landlord had 14 days to pay. Both parties agreed that 14 days was too short of a period of time on both sides of the transaction. And so where we eventually landed with the committee that was set up to make technical changes was agreement that to extend both of those timelines to 30 days and 60 days, or 60 days and 30 days. But an interesting provision that I was surprised that the group came to personally was that the renter could request relocation assistance, but stay in the rental unit for up to 6 months, paying the higher rent, but looking for another apartment because it may take some time to find another apartment, because at the time the vacancy rate was pretty tight in Portland, and it was difficult to find a unit, particularly an affordable unit. And then what the mayor, what you referred to was at the end of that 6 months, the renter then had to make a decision, which was to finally notify the landlord of an intent to end to move out and end the rental agreement, or to repay the relocation assistance in full that the landlord had provided to help facilitate them moving. If the renter does not, then the landlord can, as with any bill that's due, take them to collections and take them to court in order to recoup the funds and any legal expenses or collection expenses. So it becomes a legal mechanism that the landlord can pursue to say, I paid you relocation assistance, 6 months went by and you couldn't find a place that you wanted to move to, and you did not pay me relocation assistance. You didn't return the relocation assistance payment.
So this is when I'd asked the question earlier about what happens if the landlord just ignores the whole process and doesn't pay a tenant. And the answer is that they have to hire an attorney and go to court.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when the landlord isn't getting their money back or getting their money, they get to put the tenant in collections. Tenant doesn't have, apparently, the ability to put the landlord into collections for money that they should be owed. It's a thing that we do in our society where the people with the wherewithal set rules that make it really difficult for the people without wherewithal to fight back, in essence. So it's holding true even here, unfortunately.
It would be interesting to hear. I mean, the difference here is we're not always talking about having to go out and hire a lawyer, because there are agencies that help people with this. You know, it'd be interesting to know from them how overwhelmed they are, and how many cases they're getting, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I'd be curious. Yeah.
And if they've actually filed the lawsuit.
Right.
Since it's on, what's the status of the litigation, by the way?
Yeah, this is under litigation, right?
Yes, it is.
So where does it stand right now? Is it at the Court of Appeals or?
Yes, if the individuals who challenged it want to pursue it in the Court of Appeals, they would have to pursue it in the Court of Appeals.
Oh, no, we're talking about the lawsuit against, on the ordinance itself.
Yes.
So it's currently at the court.
I don't know what the intention of the parties that are suing the city is. It is.
It's already been appealed.
You guys won at one level of court.
Correct.
You just haven't heard whether or not they're going to.
That's correct.
So, okay.
No, they already appealed it.
They appealed it. I just didn't know if there's been a decision.
All the briefing's been filed. They're just waiting on the Court of Appeals to
rule.
At
this point, the code stands as it is until a judge rules it invalid for a particular reason.
Well, I guess I would be curious. One of the reasons that I asked you about if you were tracking any lawsuits, if someone did file a lawsuit under this provision, I just wondered if anyone has effectively argued against it as being invalid in the first place. A landlord says, you sued me, but this law is illegal in the first place under landlord-tenant. So a judge has made a ruling at the circuit court level on an actual lawsuit. You see what I'm saying? As opposed to the lawsuit against the law itself.
I'm not aware of any landlord using that.
As a defense?
As a defense to not paying relocation assistance. Yeah, I'm not aware. I haven't heard of that at this point.
So there's for us on WS 12, almost at the bottom of the page, there's an item that says a landlord shall include a description of a tenant's rights and obligations and the eligible amount of relocation assistance under this section 30.10.085 with each and any termination notice, increased notice, and relocation assistance payment. So what happens if they don't? So in other words, they send out a increase notice and they don't send a notice about this code.
The tenant has the right to take them to court and pursue some sort of action and potential damages. And it would be up to the judge to rule as to whether any damages were merited based on the circumstance. And my guess is a judge would make a determination as to whether or not the lack of providing that information in some way imposed cost or pain or suffering on the tenant.
So I hate to interrupt, unless you have another.
I have a couple questions, yeah. One was, I was looking for the language, but there were the 4 bases for having to pay relocation assistance, and one of them was substantial modification. I don't know if that's the right language in the terms of the lease.
It is.
that seemed to me like, woo, who measures that? That seems so imprecise and,
Yeah.
So is there more guidance on what that means? Or I noticed, I found it very interesting that was not the reasons for payment that show up on your sheet. So it's obviously not used as much as other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a significant topic of conversation through the technical committee and after the technical committee on what is a substantial change in the lease terms. And the committee tried to come to some sort of definition about what is the definition of a substantial change, and only found itself trying to define the definition even further. And at the end of the day, I think both sides of the conversation said, we don't have a definition that doesn't just demand more definitions, and this will have to be something that a judge rules on if someone wants to challenge on that particular provision. I can tell you the policy intent was a change in the lease terms that effectively led to a rent increase or effectively had a renter leave on their own accord in order for the landlord to try and avoid relocation assistance. So I can't think of one off the top of my head, but perhaps a renter who has a couple of pets and the landlord says, well, I'm changing your lease terms and no more pets allowed. I think that would be a case where a judge would have to rule as was the landlord trying to avoid paying relocation assistance associated with a rent increase or no cause by changing the provision of the lease terms that specifically lead that household to leave the rental unit.
Okay.
So that was the policy intent, and it has been a challenge to, we have not yet successfully found a definition that would capture that policy intent that didn't require more definitions.
And then my other question was, I know you said you weren't involved in the very initial discussions, but it sounds like you were involved for many months thereafter. Are there programs going on in other jurisdictions anywhere in the country or even in Europe or somewhere that you studied or that informed what you tried to do here?
This policy is probably one of a kind in the country. I don't know about globally, but there are smaller scale versions of relocation requirements on perhaps public housing or regulated affordable housing or senior housing or specific redevelopment efforts where this kind of payment is made or co-payment is made between the city and the landlord. But as far as a requirement like this, it's pretty unique. I think it's also challenging because Oregon and Portland, I can speak to Portland, is a no-cost standard state, and not all, but many jurisdictions, either state or municipalities, are not around the country. And so there's just a different legal framework, and so councils pursue different supplemental landlord-tenant policies based on the state legal frameworks.
What does that mean? Other states don't? You mean they can't evict for no cause?
Yeah, so I won't say most, but a large number of states or municipalities don't allow just a no-cause eviction. Mm-hmm. They will detail in statute or code the provisions under which a landlord can evict a renter. Mm-hmm. And so it's just a different legal framework, and so they're wrestling with different policy interventions in the rental housing market. But that aside, it is somewhat unique in terms of the comprehensiveness of under which it covers the Portland market. But these programs do exist on, again, specific geographies or populations or housing stock in other areas of the country.
Is there any requirement that the tenant actually use the money for anything?
No.
Could the tenant just say, I'm going to live with my mom, I'm tired of this? And
Yes.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you. I think we want to wrap up because we have a lengthy secondary conversation around the housing affordability strategy update. So, and
Thank you very much,
Thank
Matthew.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's very
Appreciate it.
helpful.
Council for
thank
having
you,
me.
Matt.
All right. Our next item is to get an update on our council goal around housing affordability. And Valeria
Yes,
is
that's
joining us.
correct. We're just gonna.
Pull this up.
Oh, there he goes.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council members. My name is Alma Flores, and I'm joined at the table with Valeria Vidal, our new Housing and Economic Development Coordinator. We are here to present to you an update over the last 5 months since the implementation and adoption of, the adoption of the Milwaukee Housing Affordability Strategy since July 17th of 2018. I can't believe only 5 months have gone by. It seems like a whirlwind of a 5-month period, but we have exciting news for you and items and updates to share. 1 second, there we go. As you know, you all adopted the 5-year strategic plan in July. And since that time, we gave ourselves 6 months to really evaluate what steps we need to take, what our work plan will look like in preparation for the short-term actions. And at the adoption, it was mentioned that we would do the short-term actions, obviously, first, with 2 midterm actions per your direction in terms of prioritization of that implementation. So completion of the 2 actions prior to full rollout of the implementation have happened. So I could say with all certainty that of the 31 actions that were adopted, we are now down to 29. We hired Valeria. And as you all know, the Metropolitan Housing Bond, or Metro's housing bond passed, and its constitutional amendment passed. So that was one of the action items that we were monitoring and ensuring that we were in the conversations related to that action. I met monthly with Jess Larson and several Metro staff for policy breakfasts to discuss the bond prior to going out to the voters and making sure that bond language was suitable. So that was a lengthy process at the front end, even prior to the housing strategy being adopted, but certainly one that we felt was a necessary action to follow in the plan itself. So that's just where we are today. And I'm going to pass the baton to Valeria, who's going to walk you through a lot of the different actions and highlights that we have for you today.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mayor, City Councilors. I'm happy to report back some of the highlights that we've been doing, other accomplishments that are helping us stay on track to successfully implement the 18 action items. So the first one is our website highlights. We have launched a new housing affordability website. And also an interactive mapping website. The housing affordability website has been designed to be aligned with our 3 main goals. Building housing and staying in your home, finding a home, and the list of resources found in each page are updated regularly and help connect each visitor with programs and resources for their current and future needs. Additionally, the website provides an overview of the housing affordability strategy, along with housing-related maps, research, policies, maps that are relevant to our housing work in Milwaukee. Our interactive mapping website has just been launched this past week, and it's accessed through our housing affordability website. It allows us to visualize the state of housing, so kind of putting some of the data points that we showed in the housing forum, but in a more user-friendly way. So not only serves as a tool to educate our residents, but also provides resources to residents as well as where our affordable housing infrastructures in the city and emergency housing as well.
I just wanted to go into the website for a quick moment, and I'm trying to figure out. Sorry. Running out of time, I guess. So I clicked on it. Oops. Where'd it go? Oh boy, I am just messing things up.
Okay.
So can I do it from here? Is that?
Control, yeah. There you go.
So you can see the attempts at the top. So just to sort of show you these interactive pages, if building a house is where you want to be, you have a list of the resources with all of the different standards. These are all interactive, so you can just click on them. Master fee schedule, the zoning, and all of these pages will be updated when we have new information.
We've really tried to centralize as much information as possible to make it just easy, fast access to anyone who's interested in building, so they don't go looking around.
Similarly, for staying in your home, you can see there are links to a lot of different organizations that provide the services for each of those categories that you see on the left-hand side, just to give you. And again, we will be adding as we get new information and updating. So.
That's correct.
Does it talk about our no cause, 90-day no cause?
So that's
there?
in the overview section of the website. We were trying to stay focused on the 3 goals and have those be really easy for people to play with, but in terms of a lot of the different actions that the council has done over the years in relation to the goal, that is in the overview, and you will see we have sort of all the different actions leading up to the report, the plan, and the website updates.
Right, so I'm sort of thinking
I'm looking for the
about it
rental
from
relocation. Where's that? Where did we?
It should be.
I should probably put my glasses on.
Should be there. If
For
not,
somebody
go to
staying-
policies and
For someone
plans.
looking to stay
So
in their home.
Stay
I
in
was
their
waiting
home.
for her
Yes.
to finish doing so she could hear what I was saying.
Yep.
So I was thinking about it from the standpoint of a tenant or somebody who wants to stay in their home,
No.
and they
Oh, in the new.
hear that Milwaukee has some kind of housing affordability thing, so they go there. If it were me, I would click on the stay in my home thing, and that would be the place where I don't think they're going to go take the time to read the whole overview. That
Yep.
would be the place that would give them some indication, oh, well, at least they have to give me 90 days. So I think any aspect, if thinking about it from the standpoint of the audience.
Okay.
So we had that in our
Yeah.
previous affordable housing website, so it seemed to have dropped off. So we will, good catch.
We'll add it.
We will add it back.
Thanks.
We had it under the overview section.
Yeah.
Keep going, Melody.
Could you click the other link really
Yep.
quick so we can show them? Okay. So in this website, we have our Milwaukee Housing Affordability Strategy as the first one, and then you can click on the different tabs to kind of give you a better perspective, simple and clean for people to understand. We have a brief description on the left corner, and if you kind of search through the other ones, just information that people did look at during the housing forum, but we didn't have enough time to put this together. And you can click in each one of those blocks. We can also look at the median rents and where they're staggered around the city. Again, and we have now added how the percentage of total moderately rent burden and severely rent burden in each one of those blocks that you can see in there.
That's a little
So-
confusing just because it says percentage and then it's 0.26.
Yes.
Does that mean to be
And
26%?
it's supposed to be 26. Yes, we are
We'll fix these
still
things.
working. Yeah,
We're in beta testing it.
beta. You're the
So
first
are-
users.
Each of those color blocks census tracts? Is that what
Yes,
they are? Okay.
we've done. Yep.
So
And-
the data is for that census tract.
And one interesting map that we had, if you go into the other ones, moderately rent burden or severely, whichever. We've been able to overlay our racial composition also to see where those severely rent burden households are in overlap with who lives there as well.
So it's in the CD summary, so I would say
Yes.
play with this link, tell us what you like, don't like, and
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah.
Love to
Yeah.
hear from that, so anyway, keep going. Go back to the PowerPoint, yeah.
Yes. And next up is just marketing highlights. As you saw in the Housing Forum, we've started with an initial marketing campaign. As part of the preliminary work that we've been doing, we have created several flyers, all of them which you saw at the Housing Forum, to support the education of our community on the state of housing and also resources available. Customer service highlights. Since the adoption, we have been tracking housing-related inquiries by residents and developers. We also have a comprehensive plan code revision waiting list database, so anyone that comes into our building and is interested in doing something that the code currently cannot allow them to do, we keep track of those, and we are planning to get back to them as soon as those changes have been made and are useful for them. And again, we keep a database of interested developers as well.
So what, on the first one,
Yeah.
I mean, roughly how many have you gotten so far?
In the 5 months, I have only gotten 2 calls.
Okay.
And they have both been about my landlord is raising my rent. Is there anything in place? And we usually talk about, or when is he supposed to let me know? So it's more informative on what's happened. We provide resources, and then I follow up with them to know where it stayed. So.
What about on the second bullet?
Yes.
Can you give me an example of something where someone wants to do something and they can't now, but we're holding it?
ADUs.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Which they can,
So-
they just
Which-
don't, they're costly.
Yeah.
They're,
They're
exactly.
costly, and
And
we have
also
100 different
some-
rules that
right.
really restrict them to.
Right.
Yes.
Very difficult to do.
Yes. And I believe that's last but not least our Housing Forum highlights. We had 90 people officially signed in, but 115 people received our informational packets. We broke down the attendees: 54 residents, 53 representatives from organizations, 6 people viewed our YouTube live stream, and so far we've had 45 views of the video on YouTube up until yesterday.
When you say representatives from organizations, does that include us and the comp plan advisory committee? Are those
Correct.
organizations? So we had-
City affiliated.
So we had
and
54 residents
organizations.
on top of those groups of people?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah. But that has not been everything that we've been working on. There's obviously been a lot of other projects that we continue to supervise, as our cottage cluster feasibility study. Our third SAG is coming up in January. Our ADU cottage, the construction excise tax program details, additional outreach and marketing materials. Phase 2 is going to start in the spring. We continue to build and maintain partnerships. We continue to monitor the housing bond implementation. We do website maintenance with resources. We attend almost biweekly meetings for the Hillside Master Plan. And kind of what Alma just did today, continue the discussions around tenant relocation policies.
So you have the table that sort of highlights the 18 action items.
Page
that are-
26 on your.
Thank you. And 2 are highlighted. Sorry, I need to put my glasses on. I'm getting old for this now. Actually, that's not helping. This is really small. Sorry, I can't read our own attachment. So as you can see, these are the short term with the 2 midterm actions that were highlighted for you. They're not the full 31 actions here, but as you can see, we've made progress on a few, and we will continue making progress in terms of the column that has the work to date to sort of represent what we've been doing to sort of set ourselves up for the full implementation and adoption or work that is involved with each item. For instance, when we say explore programs for affordable housing through existing construction excise tax, we've been working through details related to setting up a committee that will then help us formulate the program details for how to spend the money that we are accruing through the construction excise tax for affordable housing. As you can see, we have over 279,000 currently in the CET fund, if you will. So we need to start pulling together based on the details that the regulation at the state had for residential CET monies versus the commercial industrial monies that were accrued. We had a separate programming for that. So we need to start programming it and start putting the buckets, if you will, of monies in each of those categories, for instance. So that's what we would be working through and formulating a committee to help sort of monitor it, just to make sure that just between staff, we're not necessarily creating program details that don't suit what the actual interests are in the community and needs. We're exploring the incentivizing the development of affordable units through a local property tax exemption. That's definitely something that it requires a lot of partnerships and conversations with different entities like our partners at the county. So we need to start, coordinating all of those meetings and discussions and outreach efforts. So we'll be ramping up for that. You look like you want to ask.
Right. Well, in this, it talks about that, and then it says staff participates monthly in meetings with the Clackamas County Housing and Homelessness Task Force. There are currently no initiatives being discussed to alleviate county taxes.
We have several more meetings of that task force. It doesn't mean it won't come up, and it has been brought up casually, but certainly it hasn't been an action item as we've identified in terms of right-sizing the county impacts on property tax and tax exemption specifically, and how they impact it. At the moment, we control, gosh, I'm going to blank on the exact number, but in order to pass a property tax exemption, as you know, when we did that with the Northwest Housing Alternatives Project, we needed 51% of our taxing districts to be on board. When you start to piece together all of the different taxing jurisdictions and what percentage of that pie they hold, a good chunk is held by the City of Milwaukee and the school board alone, or a hodgepodge of a lot of different departments within the county, like parks, water, WES. So those are all part of that taxing district pie for property taxes. So those are all the conversations that we need to have with those entities to determine whether or not we're pursuing the property tax exemption for nonprofit development. The county at this task force has not been going into that level of detail yet. It's still formulating the rationale for what it needs to do from a policy perspective. We're on meeting 7, and I believe there's about 6 more. So we're, I'd say, halfway through that process, and
is that task force where the county is having its discussions about, with the Housing Authority, about positioning projects for the Metro bond?
so there are several.
Is that a completely separate conversation?
Well, it's tied, but it is separate. Those discussions are happening at the Housing Advisory Board for Clackamas County's Housing Authority. And I serve on that board. So we are having those discussions in terms of developing the criteria under which the housing bond resources would be allocated.
And would this discussion not make sense for that body to be having?
And it has been brought up
Yeah.
that it needs to overlap into the housing task force discussions as well. It's a large group, and it's really hard to mobilize the discussions, and so the consultants and the Clackamas County staff are really trying to piece all of it together. There are just so many moving parts from those discussions that they haven't really honed in entirely on any one solution because it's going through a process to get there, but they have discussed tying the two, what the HAB, the Housing Advisory Board at Clackamas County, and this task force working together. The Housing Authority staff are present at the task force meetings, so we get that overlap from that. Just the conversations haven't always been directed at one particular action over another.
Is there any indication that the Housing Authority staff is vetting that issue with the commissioners, or that they're interested in that issue?
In which issue? The
tax
housing
exemption.
bond? Oh, the tax exemption? I don't know.
No.
But these are the types of actions that we need to then pursue. So these are sort of tasks under a work plan for that particular action item in the MHAS that we would need to then follow up on. So those are questions that I would want to have either at the task force or separately in a meeting with county staff, for instance.
Okay.
What this report and this update is meant to display is that we're on it and that there are a lot of moving parts to track and to follow 18 action items at this time over the next year. There are a lot of moving parts, and it isn't just simply I could wave a wand and it's done, except for hiring.
That wand has been waved.
And the voters, voted for the housing bond and the constitutional amendment. The next steps, the county wasn't moving toward having a plan, if you will, on the housing bond until it passed. So we're now having to do a lot of that work with them. And I think their deadline with Metro is January for the plan, to have a plan of action, at least.
They have to have that
something
a skeletal
approved.
concept. Yeah, they don't have to have anything fleshed out until June or July or something.
So it's following that timeline, and we don't control it entirely, so we're a participant in that discussion. Create an internal culture that is friendly to developers. The Community Development Department has been working over the past year, actually, on developing checklists to streamline the permitting process so that there's sort of clear language being used with potential developers, whether it's multifamily or single family or commercial, industrial, to make sure that they have the right information for the questions that are being asked. Right now, our system is we have pre-development conferences or pre-development meetings with potential developers or people interested in doing a subdivision or land use application of all sorts. That it was based merely on sort of questions they may have of us and of staff. And it's only an hour. So we've developed a checklist to sort of help them create the questions that may give them more bang for the buck, if you will, in terms of the time and efficiency of that time that they have with staff to go over fire, life, and safety issues, building permit, engineering, planning, land use related questions so that it helps them guide the process as well, and ask questions related to their STCs or to the permits that will be needed. And it's a little more robust of a conversation so that they're not just either dealing with transportation at that time and they're maximizing the use of the time with staff. We're in beta testing of that as well. We were testing the development checklist with the library and the high school internally. I think we're at a level now that we're using that tool externally so that customers also have that checklist with them. We're using an internal checklist to make sure that we're covering sort of the items that we need to discuss with that applicant. So those are the things that I see as relating to 1.4 and sort of making the process for the developers streamlined to get that supply, to build those homes that we need. Anyway, I can go fully down the list. You all have it, and I don't know if you had any recommendations in terms of any shifting of prioritization. I know we're running a little bit short on time, so that's why I'm going to stop without going line by line. But if you like me going line by line, I can do that as well. And I am having a lot of trouble reading this.
I can read them. Zoom in.
Do you guys need her to go through it, Marlene?
No.
I don't either.
Or shall we just continue with the 18 the way they are? They're based on the different partnerships that we establish. If one track is going faster than the other, we're just responding and reacting to both the interest and the time frame that we have.
The process that's occurring around Hillside, as far as the outreach and all of that, where would you say we are in that process?
I'm going to let you answer that question because you were at the last charrette, sorry.
Yes.
The last charrette, we've been attending most of the meetings, if not all the meetings, both on the technical advisory, project team meetings, and the stakeholder advisory group meetings. Valeria has an added meeting that she attends, and that's the health impact assessment group. I missed the last charrette, so I'm going to let her start with that in terms of where they are, because they've given you an update in terms of the process, I believe, about a month and a half ago, and they'll be before you in January, again, giving you another update. But since then, the lady has been at those meetings.
Yeah, last week we had an internal design charrette, just understanding the site and what could possibly we could possibly do there. So it was kind of like a puzzle almost on trying to fit in different scenarios. High density, low density, no numbers attached. So far, it was just kind of brainstorming how that would look like if we focused on open spaces, or whether we focused on townhomes, or sort of everything. And we just went through that kind of as our own exercise of understanding what seems to be realistic and what seems to be feasible, and the different arrangements that that provides, and the potential sacrifices for one thing or another might end up if we use the variables different. So that's what we did, and we didn't make any decisions. It was kind of just like a brainstorming. The next step for them is they're trying to find a day to then go out to the community and doing a design, similar design charrette with the community, and see what they come up with. And then from that, kind of putting all of the options together and crunching some numbers from there. So I think they're trying to decide on a day on February or March as of right now. Nothing has been settled, but yeah, it'd be to go through the same exercise that we did with the community.
So the charrette you were talking about was with the technical?
It was internal. So it was county, city staff.
Consultants.
And the consultants, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
So the open house is the one where I would say you absolutely should be there, and that'll be obviously a community-wide effort. Are the timelines in terms of, this is what was in the adopted plan for each of these action items, is there anything that needs to be reprioritized so that could help guide and focus some of the work, if there's something that you'd like us to shuffle?
Well, I guess I'd turn that background on you. Do you think there's anything, I mean, we did all this before the housing bond passed. Given that the housing bond passed, do you think there's anything we should reprioritize in order to prepare to take full advantage of the bond?
No, I think we're in alignment across with that expectation, and the expectation was met in terms of the housing bond passing. No, what it does mean, though, is that what we didn't flag in the affordable housing strategy is that if it did pass, the amount of work it would be to coordinate the efforts for Milwaukee, if that's where we want to go. Hillside is the likely place, but we don't know for sure whether that's what the county is also thinking, whether the commissioners are thinking that. So tracking that is what I'm doing now by serving on the Housing Advisory Board. So a lot of that wasn't necessarily captured in here, so that's additional work on top of what was here. So I would say there isn't anything to reprioritize more so than add to the existing scope here, but it's part of the work. It's not outside of, in my opinion, out of the work. It's part of it. So I don't have anything to reshuffle or reprioritize. It's all part of it. If that answers your question,
I mean, I guess to me, the bond and the hillside are the the big opportunities that we can't squander. And so if some things on here have to shift to a slower pace to allow you to, get those things done, I think.
That's where I was
That's what you were
going.
doing. So I would say there's a lot of groupings that I see here with the website and the role and the outreach aspect of it, that I could say, the maintenance of those things and the updating of those pieces. We could probably minimize that because I think there's a lot of really good, robust information already out there on the website, so we can step back from that and refocus on the hillside and the bond.
And I don't think, you indicated that there was some unsureness about whether or not we intend or expect to be able to utilize some of the housing bond at Hillside. I don't think there's any ambivalence on this council about that. I think we're pretty committed to, yes, that's what we want to do.
Yeah,
So,
and
whatever that takes.
And I've been going to those meetings with that message. And I think that's the Hillside, the Clackamas County folks understand that Hillside is that opportunity area for it. We're just not there yet in the process in terms of the financial feasibility and all that, the finance piece, because they may be going after other types of funds too to complement it, especially with the constitutional amendment.
Sure, but it's a big project, and there's going to be a lot of buildings, and so there may be some buildings that we could make sure get built with this bond, and other buildings that may take packages. I don't want the worrying about we don't have the package for this building together, keeping us from doing the thing that utilizes the bond money.
I think that is the project that they're contemplating strongly.
Okay.
And by they, I mean the county.
Is some of that feasibility so I assume, it took into consideration, or I guess I should ask, is it taking into consideration, potential for changes? So, currently it's, it's zoned a certain way. We're also, looking at it, we're getting into the comp plan, we're looking with an eye toward, potential zone changes. So, was any of that part of the conversation about whether or not, some eventual application would come to us requiring either some
Mix of uses.
Yeah.
So
changes.
That's the
whether that
intent,
was,
and that's, they know they need to do some zoning code changes to reflect where at least the conversations have been going. In terms
based on what
of
their goals are for how many.
In terms of the 4 to 1, yes, wanting to be at least.
And Denny and David have been participating as well.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, those meetings they
coming.
had at the hospital, those public meetings, they had mixed-use buildings in there.
Sure.
So they obviously saw.
That they have to. It's just a
They
matter
were
of
obviously not feeling constrained by the current zoning.
No, and it has to go through a process. The likelihood is there are going to be zoning code changes.
Right.
But because it hasn't gone through the full process with the community in terms of what they would like to see, but it's very likely to have.
But they were,
changes.
so I went to the first one of those two, and one of them, it sounded like, asking the community if that's what they want. And so I think, and so then I'm wondering if that is, that feedback, was that considered in sort of that technical exercise, and then all of that together is contemplating perhaps, either a variance request or bigger request to us, or?
It was in the presentation that they gave to us. They did include it as part of the guidelines to take into consideration that this had been the feedback in the previous work sessions that they had with the community. So yes, it was nice to see that everyone was also bringing it back to what they heard from people at those events as well. Just here in the open space and some other features that they were looking at. So everyone seemed very invested in making sure that we were continuing to follow through with the feedback. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope you're all pleased with
Yes, that-
what we've been doing to date in setting up the full implementation of the strategy.
Looks great.
Thanks
I
to
look forward
staff.
to exploring your website.
Yeah.
I've explored the first,
Yeah, not
the first website, but not the mapping one, so I'm looking forward to that.
That's
We'll
new.
make sure we make the changes ASAP.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. All right. Upon adjournment of the work session, council will host a reception for retiring Councilor Shane Abma in the council chambers. The event is open to the public and will not be broadcast. So with that, I adjourn the council or the work session.